This is a CBC podcast.
You know, I follow people on Twitter, lots of us, especially, a spot for journalists to hang out and tweet stuff. Sometimes it could be about stories, food, who knows. For me, it's also a great place to kind of keep track of some very smart and fantastic people. So I've been following the work of a MUN PhD student. Her name is Robin S. Lacey, and she's studying with the archaeology department at MUN. So she's doing that, and she also runs a business with her husband. It's called Black Cat Cemetery Preservation. So following on Twitter, there's always updates of the work that they're doing, and I was curious about it. So last week, I met Robin at the General Protestant Cemetery in St. John's because I wanted to kind of know about the work they're doing, and I figured, we may as well go to where you do work, so there's nothing like meeting a stranger in a cemetery for a chat about restoring headstones and restoration work for cemeteries. So here's our chat.
And we came down after the storm to make sure there hadn't been any major damage. Oh, they're doing some tree work over there. Yeah, to make sure there wasn't any large damage done to the work we had done. And everything was fine. I didn't notice any major damage from the trees to the headstones anywhere where we looked, luckily.
What are we looking at?
So this is a chest tomb, which is basically a large box. It's called that because it looks like a chest or a trunk. And it's an above ground monument. There's no one inside it. It's a hollow stone box, and the person would be buried underneath it. But this is one that my husband and I recently did conservation work on for the cemetery board. It's in as many pieces as it was built in, but then a lot of those pieces were broken. It had been sort of collapsed and fallen over for decades. So we spent the last couple weeks putting it back together, which was quite a feat. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to lift some of the pieces because it's heavy marble. And part of it was sunk about a foot into the ground. It has sort of been pushed over by the tree and collapsed down. So when we opened it up and took the pieces apart, we found that it had this marble base slab, which is this really weird, I've never seen that before in this type of monument. This very large piece of marble that made up the bottom of it, which is very ornate and would have been very expensive. This one, the fellow died in 1839, which is interesting because the cemetery wasn't opened until the early 1840s, so we're not quite sure what's going on here. The local historian, Susan Sexty, she said she's been doing research on this guy, Andrew McCracken. He doesn't have a Newfoundland last name. We're not sure why he's buried here or when specifically he was buried because he did die before the cemetery opened. So that's quite interesting. And when we were doing the restoration, we had to move the piece of the bottom of the stone. And it showed, when we took it up, what it looks like beneath is brick lined, and then you could see the original fill for the grave shaft. So this is a early 19th century burial shaft that has brick going all the way down like we would use concrete today.
You mentioned pieces and that kind of thing. How do you do this restoration work? What kind of stuff is involved with it?
So it's a lot of basically stone conservation. Like all sciences, requires a lot of research and upkeep. So I always tell people before they do anything to a gravestone, make sure you're doing your research on what to do, because there's a lot of things like soaps and putting flour on them and stuff that can cause damage to the stone. So what we did for this is took it all apart very carefully. There were previous repairs that used concrete, so some of the pieces didn't fit quite back together because there's this concrete on them. You can't get concrete off of soft stone without breaking pieces of the stone off itself, so we didn't want to do that, of course. And then we used a UV stable stone epoxy, which means it won't discolor if sunlight gets on it for too long, but you can't see any of it because it's all inside, to put the pieces back together. And luckily the pillars, there's 4 pillars in the corners of this monument, and they were all numbered. So the underside of the top has Roman numerals on it, the top of the pillars have Roman numerals on them, and the base has numerals there's sort of these pockets carved into it. So we knew exactly where all the pieces were because the mason did an amazing job when this was constructed. And then we just puzzle pieced it back together, basically. After cleaning it. And you clean stones like this with basically just water and a soft brush, so a plastic bristled dish brush or something with natural fibers, no metal. And then we used a biological cleaner called D2 Biological Solution, which is one of the only safe cleaners to use on stone.
How did you get into being interested in this?
So I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was in grade 1. And I never changed my mind, apparently. So yeah, I'm doing my PhD in archaeology right now, and all my research for my master's, which I also did at MUN, was in like 17th century burial grounds and sort of like the organization of like death spaces versus life spaces in early colonial settlements. And through that, I did a lot of research on how to protect these types of sites and protect these types of stones. And then a couple years ago, I had a summer job working at a cemetery in Ontario as a monument conservator, so I got to be trained doing the actual hands-on part rather than just the theory. And then so when we moved back to Newfoundland, there was a big need for restoration with like the background of knowing about the history and knowing about like how to take care of these objects and not just go in there and scrub them with soap and stuff. So my husband and I started a small business to hopefully provide that service.
So what's the state of our cemeteries then in terms of needing upkeep and stuff?
It's pretty much the same as like every historical site. Like we're in the Protestant Cemetery right now. There's ones that are in really gorgeous shape, like the Crosby monuments behind us, and then there's ones that are almost 200 years old and like a branch has fallen on them, or they're made of a softer material and they fall over. Sites like this basically need constant upkeep, just like any historic building would. So yeah, it's various it's in various states of like really nice to like collapsing into the ground, and you see that like anywhere that has like a site that's more than like 20 years old.
When you're kind of doing your work in graveyards, what is it about it that just fascinates you or just kind of really attracts you to this?
I feel like I can't really put a finger on that specifically. Like, so when you do an undergrad in archaeology, one of the things you usually have to do is like a field school. So you go out there and get like hands-on experience, like digging, doing surveys and stuff like that. And that's usually part of a program. And so I did my field school through the University of Liverpool, and we were started in Ireland doing graveyard surveys. And initially I wanted to do like marine archaeology, underwater, like shipwrecks, or I wanted to do like archaeology in Mesoamerica and look at like the Mayans. And then I sat down in a cemetery for like one day in Ireland and was like, well, I think this is where I'm going to be forever. It's like this amazing way of connecting with the history of specifically like I think smaller communities. You can tell like so much more about a population from like what they left behind in their burial spaces and like how they were commemorating people and those rituals that went along with like the end of life process that you don't sometimes get to see when you do archaeology of like phenomenal sites. When you look at like kings and stuff like that, that's like a small portion of the population, but you can get so much better of an idea of like how people were living and dying if you look at a burial space that incorporates all of that.
So what kinds of things do you notice around here?
The wood cutting right now.
Yeah.
Luckily, I didn't see too much damage from the storm in the cemetery, which is great. Yeah, we've got a lot of variety of monuments, and people that could afford it have really big ones, like McCracken here with his massive marble chest tomb that did at one point have iron railings around it as well. We found the tops, like the finials of the fence. They're over there. But yeah, so there's like mixed in with the big fancy stones, there's these like quite small, simple marble stones. So it's really like, you can tell that it was a space for like everybody, really. And then when you look at smaller community sites in the outports, there might be like one or two larger monuments for like maybe the merchant families that could afford it or fishermen who are doing really well. But often there'll be unmarked graves and there'll be field stones marking some of the burials, which are just like pieces of rock that people found and like semi-shaped into a gravestone shape and just put there to mark their loved one's burial place.
You're right. I just find this fascinating too, to be honest. Like just talking about Mr. McCracken here and then just looking what you can find out. Such an interesting way to connect, to look at that connection to the past in a place where it's, well, dead people.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Gravestones are like, it's an artifact, it's a memorial, it's a document, and like a piece of sculpture. There's so much information you can like tease out from these types of sites. It's really cool.
That was my cemetery chat with Robin S. Lacey, an archaeology PhD student and co-director of Black Cat Cemetery Preservation.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.